Before we begin, find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Tonight, we are not going anywhere urgent. Tonight, we are going somewhere ancient. Close your eyes, if you like, or let them soften, unfocused, as if you are looking through this moment rather than at it. Because what I am about to tell you happened a very long time ago, in a land between two rivers, in a civilization that built cities while the rest of the world still slept in mud huts, in temples so precisely constructed that modern engineers cannot fully explain how they were erected. And then, all at once, in a window of time so narrow it barely registers in geological terms, it all went silent. The gods left. Not slowly, not gradually, not through the ordinary erosion of belief that history usually records. They left deliberately, systematically, following protocols, leaving behind empty thrones, sealed chambers, and a species of bewildered humans who would spend the next 4,000 years trying to understand what had happened. Tonight, we are going to try to understand it too. There is a document, a clay tablet, or rather, a series of clay tablets, discovered across multiple archaeological sites, some in Baghdad, some in Philadelphia, some in London. Scholars call it the Sumerian King List, and for over a century, it has quietly puzzled every serious historian who has encountered it. The puzzlement is understandable, because the Sumerian King List begins with a mathematical impossibility. Alulim of Eridu, the first king named in the record, ruled for 28,800 years. Read that again, 28,800 years. Dumuzid of Bad Tabira held power for 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tabira reigned for 43,200 years. These are not approximations. These are not symbolic numbers inserted by later mythological tradition. These figures are carved with meticulous precision into the clay, using the same mathematical notation that Sumerian scribes used to calculate grain harvests and tax records. The ancient Mesopotamians were extraordinary accountants. They recorded everything: the number of fish delivered to a temple storehouse, the weight of silver exchanged in a commercial transaction, the acreage of irrigated farmland assigned to a particular deity's estate. When Sumerian scribes wrote a number, they meant that number. And yet, at a specific point in the list, a point that scholars have come to call the divine withdrawal, the numbers change abruptly, completely, without explanation. The kings who follow the great ancients rule for decades, for human lifespans, for the kind of time that flesh and bone can actually endure. What happened at the pivot point? The tablets tell us, in the restrained language of ancient administrative record, the gods turned their faces away. The divine favor departed from the land. That is all they say. That is the entire explanation offered by the most meticulous record keepers of the ancient world for one of the most dramatic transitions in the history of their civilization. Notice how it is not the language of myth. It is not the elevated poetry of religious narrative. It is bureaucratic language, administrative language, the language of a scribe recording a fact. Something changed in 2400 BC, something that the people who lived through it described not as a religious transformation, not as a change in belief, but as a physical event, a departure, a withdrawal. And the physical evidence, scattered across the ruins of Mesopotamia's greatest cities, suggests they were right. The city of Uruk, often considered the world's first true urban settlement, sits in the archaeological record like a book with a chapter torn out. The city was thriving. Construction was underway. The massive White Temple, dominating the sacred Anu district for centuries, gleaming limestone against the Mesopotamian sky, was in the middle of a renovation campaign. And then, the workers put down their tools, not at the end of a workday, not at the completion of a phase. Excavations of the site reveal trowels, chisels, and forming instruments left exactly where they fell, as if their owners had simply stopped mid-motion and walked away. The renovation was never completed. The architectural plans, represented in the structural logic of the foundations, were abandoned in the middle of their execution. Archaeologists who study site abandonment patterns know what organic cessation looks like. It looks like gradual reduction, fewer workers, scaled-back ambitions, buildings that taper off in quality as resources diminish. What happened at Uruk looks like none of those things. It looks like a switch was thrown. But the tools are only the beginning of the story. Beneath the temples of Uruk, beneath temples across all of Mesopotamia, ran an elaborate network of underground chambers that modern scholars have given the Sumerian name, Abzu connections. These were not simple drainage systems, though they did channel liquid. They were spiritual architecture, sacred plumbing, precisely engineered conduits that carried libations, sacred oils, and ritual fluids from the altar spaces above, down through stone channels, into underground collection chambers that temple theology placed at the boundary between the earthly world and the primordial waters where the gods were believed to dwell. The Abzu was not metaphorical. To the Sumerians, it was a specific location, a subterranean realm of fresh water that underlaid the physical world, home to Enki, the god of wisdom, and the source of all creative intelligence. The underground chambers of their temples were understood as literal interface points between the human and divine realms. These chambers were sealed, all of them, across multiple cities, within the same narrow band of time. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the sealed Abzu chambers, burned offerings, plant matter, the remnants of ritual activity, consistently returns dates between 2400 and 2350 BC. The precision of this convergence is striking. We are not talking about regional variation, about one city shutting down while another continues. We are talking about a coordinated closure across an entire civilization. Somebody, or something, gave an order, and it was followed everywhere, simultaneously, without exception. The Royal Cemetery of Ur is one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, these burial chambers from the early dynastic period reveal a practice that had characterized Sumerian kingship for centuries. When a great ruler died, they did not go alone. Decades of physical and skeletal evidence from the death pits of Ur document something astonishing. Dozens of attendants, musicians with their instruments, soldiers with their weapons, servants with their vessels, court ladies with their headdresses still perfectly arranged, died alongside their rulers. Toxicological analysis of the skeletal remains suggests they consumed poison willingly, in an orderly fashion, after taking up their ceremonial positions in the burial chamber. They believed something. They believed it absolutely enough to die for it. They believed that the ruler they served was divine, a physical embodiment of cosmic authority. and that their service would continue in whatever realm came next. The last of these grand burials dates to approximately 2050 BC, and then they stop. The final tomb, to contain mass burials, shows signs of hasty completion. Several chambers left unfinished, grave goods of notably inferior quality compared to earlier interments, as if the people preparing the burial knew, partway through, that the theology justifying the practice had been suddenly and irrevocably invalidated. The ideology of divine kingship collapsed at roughly the same moment across Mesopotamia, because the gods, as far as the archaeological record can tell us, had left the temples. Eridu is the oldest. Every Sumerian source agrees on this. Before Nippur, before Uruk, before Ur, there was Eridu, the first city created by the gods, the original point of contact between divine intelligence and the human world. At Eridu, archaeologists have traced 18 successive rebuilding phases of the main temple dedicated to Enki, extending across nearly 2,000 years of continuous religious practice. Each reconstruction maintained the same fundamental plan and orientation, a same relationship to the cardinal directions, a sacred geometry transmitted unchanged across 70 generations of priests, and then the 18th and final reconstruction, dating to approximately 2400 BC, shows radical departures from everything that came before. Most puzzling of all, the innermost sacred chamber, the Holy of Holies, where the divine statue resided, was redesigned with an unprecedented feature, an exit passage, leading directly to the exterior of the building. In over 1,800 years of Mesopotamian temple architecture, this feature appears nowhere. Temples had entrances for worshippers. They had processional routes and ritual pathways. They did not have exit passages from the innermost sanctuary leading outward, because the innermost sanctuary was where the god was. Why would a god need an exit unless the god was leaving? Among the clay tablets found in the Eridu Temple Archive is one catalogued as Eridu Temple Archive 247. It is not a myth. It is an inventory record, a careful accounting of objects removed from the sacred chamber, divine regalia, ceremonial vessels, objects of gold and lapis lazuli that had adorned the statue of Enki for centuries. The final notation on the tablet reads, "These objects were placed in vessels for the long journey. They were never to return to their places." An inventory, a departure checklist, written by a scribe whose handwriting, according to paleographers who have studied the tablet, shows signs of distress, irregular pressure on the stylus, characters formed with less precision than professional scribal training would normally produce. The scribe who wrote that final notation was afraid, or grieving, or both. Something very real had happened at Eridu, and whoever was responsible had packed their belongings and gone. The sky above ancient Mesopotamia was not the sky we see tonight. Or rather, it was exactly the same sky, hung with the same stars, governed by the same mathematics. But the people watching it were different. They were professional watchers, priests, whose entire vocation was the continuous, systematic, rigorous observation of celestial phenomena. Temple astronomers who maintained unbroken records across generations, who developed sophisticated mathematical models to predict planetary positions, who understood the movements of the visible universe with a precision that would not be matched in the Western world for another 2,000 years. The Mesopotamian astronomical diaries are one of humanity's most remarkable intellectual achievements. Maintained continuously for over a millennium, they represent the first sustained scientific project in recorded history. These were not astrological writings, or not only astrological. They were empirical records, careful, precise, maintained according to standardized formats on standardized clay tablets. The astronomical diaries from the critical period between 2450 and 2350 BC contain something unusual. They contain entries that appear nowhere in earlier records. Entries describing what the ancient Mesopotamian astronomical terminology called stars walking from their places. The heaven road disturbed. These phrases are not poetic. In the technical vocabulary of Mesopotamian astronomy, they denote specific observed phenomena, deviations from predicted positions, celestial events that the mathematical models, which were very good mathematical models, did not account for. Something was happening in the sky that the astronomer priests had never seen before. Tablet BM 34580, housed in the British Museum's collection in London, provides the most detailed account of this extraordinary period. The tablet was written by Nabu Ramani, identified in his own text as an astronomer priest serving in Babylon. His hand is controlled, professional. He was a trained scribe, but the content of his observations breaks from anything his predecessors had documented. Nabu Ramani describes the appearance of what he calls the fire star that moves against the wind of heaven, a star, or more precisely, an object in the sky that moved against the prevailing direction of celestial motion. Modern astronomical calculation, applied to the period Nabu Ramani was documenting, suggests this description is consistent with a large meteor or small asteroid on a retrograde approach trajectory, an object large enough and slow enough to be tracked over multiple nights. Nabu Ramani tracked this object for 27 days. He recorded its position each night with the precision his training demanded. He noted its appearance in the constellation of the Bull of Heaven, what we call Taurus, and its progressive movement toward the Eagle, the constellation we know as Aquila. But it is not the object itself that most compels attention. It is what Nabu Ramani recorded as secondary effects of its passage. He notes that during the fire star's transit, the normal stellar positions appeared troubled, several bright stars showing unusual variations in brightness. His measurements, converted to modern astronomical terms, describe what contemporary scientists would recognize as atmospheric scintillation caused by particulate debris entering Earth's upper atmosphere. The sky was disturbed at altitude. Something was coming through. Nabu Ramani also records what he describes as colored veils dancing in the northern sky. Extraordinary lights, red, green, blue curtains of luminescence visible from Babylon's latitude, a phenomenon that modern atmospheric physics identifies as aurora borealis, but which at Babylon's geographic position would have required geomagnetic disturbance of extraordinary intensity to be visible. These additions focus on what the tablets term signs of divine departure, astronomical configurations interpreted not as omens about crops or wars or royal fortunes, but as indicators that the gods themselves were preparing to leave their earthly abodes. Tablet 23 of the expanded Enuma Anu Enlil describes a specific planetary configuration, Mars in conjunction with Saturn, while Jupiter stood in opposition to both, occurring during the heliacal rising of Sirius. The text states that when this configuration occurred, it signified the gods gathering for council in distant places. Modern astronomical software, applied to the period in question, confirms that precisely this configuration occurred in 2394 BC. The ancient astronomers were not speculating, they were recording. There is a tablet in the collection of the University Museum, catalogued as U7847, that stands apart from all other Mesopotamian astronomical documents. It is a countdown, a calendar of celestial markers, specific observable phenomena arranged in sequence, each precisely dated, each apparently corresponding to a stage in a process that the tablet's creators considered inevitable and imminent. The countdown begins with observations of unusual solar activity, the sun's face marked with dark spots that move across its brightness. We now know that what ancient observers with sufficiently sharp eyes could perceive during periods of maximum solar activity are sunspot clusters large enough to be visible to the naked eye. The final entry on the tablet corresponds to what modern calendar conversion places in the late summer of 2387 BC. It reads, "The heaven road opens, the great ones depart, the watchers see no more, and then nothing, no subsequent entries." The systematic astronomical observations that had continued for centuries ended, not gradually, not replaced by simpler records. They simply stopped. The watchers stopped watching. At Nippur, the sacred precinct of Enlil, the most important divine city in all of Mesopotamia, underwent radical modifications, beginning precisely when the astronomical diaries record the onset of unusual celestial activity. The temple's primary altar, which had maintained the same orientation for over 800 years, was rotated 23 degrees to the east. 23 degrees, a specific, calculated number. Calculations based on the new alignment reveal that the altar was repositioned to face the helical rising point of a star cluster that the tablets identify as the place where the divine assembly gathers, the Pleiades. The Pleiades, the seven sisters of modern astronomy, held extraordinary significance in Mesopotamian cosmology. They were understood as the celestial representation of the Anunnaki Council, the gathering point of the divine assembly when the gods convened to determine the fates of the world below. The priests at Nippur, in the middle of the crisis, rotated their most sacred altar to face the place where they believed their gods had gone. It is one of the most human things in all of ancient history. The builders of a civilization, watching the light go out, turning to face the direction in which it had disappeared, still reaching. Let me tell you about a man named An-Annatum. He was a high priest of the third rank, serving in the Enlil temple at Nippur. He had been performing the pre-dawn purification ritual, the same ritual, in the same sequence of gestures and spoken formulas, on every single morning for more than 20 years. It was not a burden. It was a vocation. His entire identity was organized around the daily experience of approaching the divine presence that inhabited the sacred chamber at the heart of the temple. The tablet that preserves his account is severely damaged, catalogued as NPL 4472 in the Oriental Institute collection in Chicago. Large sections are missing. The surviving text requires careful reconstruction, but what remains is extraordinary. An-Annatum describes entering the inner sanctum for the pre-dawn purification ritual on what he calls the night of the Great Silence. He notes, with professional precision, the time of his entry, after the second watch of night, before the rising of the morning star. Standard timing for the ritual he had performed thousands of times, but when he entered the chamber, he found it transformed. The eternal flame, the sacred fire that priests maintained in continuous burning for 8 centuries, was burning with an unusual blue-white radiance, not the orange warmth of a normal fire. Something colder, something that cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, that illuminated the chamber in a way that made familiar objects look strange. Anomaly notes, with the methodical care of a trained observer, that the divine statue of Enlil had changed orientation. He had placed the statue himself 10 years earlier, facing east, toward the rising sun, toward the source of light and order. The statue was now facing north. In Mesopotamian cosmology, north was the direction of the underworld, the entrance to the realm of the dead. The god's statue was facing the wrong direction. Anomaly began to perform the purification ritual anyway. He took up the consecrated water drawn from the temple's holy well. He prepared the ceremonial vessel. He began to pour. The water would not pour normally. According to his account, the liquid formed spherical droplets, perfect spheres that hovered momentarily in the air before falling to the floor in patterns that Anomaly recognized as cuneiform script, archaic cuneiform, a dialect that, according to his notation, predated the standard writing of his own period by centuries. A message, written in water, in a dead language, by something that apparently knew both. And then, the statue of Enlil wept. The eyes of the statue, inlaid with precious stones in their deep-cut sockets, produced a substance that ran down the carved stone face in narrow rivulets. Analysis of residue from similar accounts at other temple sites suggests the substance was metallic, possibly liquid gold, possibly an alloy with a very low melting point that could have been activated by the unusual heat signature of the anomalous flame. Anomaly, confronting all of this, the wrong-colored fire, the repositioned statue, the impossible water, the weeping eyes, did not run. He waited. He stood in the sacred chamber and waited for what would come next. What came next was a voice. The voice, Anomaly writes, seemed to emanate from the stone of the statue itself, rather than from any visible mouth. Not from outside the stone, not projected through any mechanism he could identify. From within the material of the figure, as if the stone itself had learned to speak. The divine presence spoke to Anomaly directly, in words that the priest recorded in his account with meticulous care, understanding, apparently, that he was documenting something of extreme historical importance. The content of the divine communication was this: the time had come for the great withdrawal. The gods would no longer maintain their earthly residences. What had been established at the beginning of civilization, the direct physical presence of advanced intelligence in the temples of Mesopotamia, was now concluding. The process was deliberate. It was coordinated. It had a protocol, and Anomaly was to follow that protocol. The instructions covered 4 categories of action. First, the systematic extinguishing of all sacred fires in a specific sequence. Lesser deities first, the great flames last. Second, the removal of specific foundation stones from the temple's most sacred areas, whose removal would sever what the divine voice called the cords that bind heaven to earth. Third, the performance of incantations that would seal the gates between worlds. Fourth, the gathering of specific sacred objects and their preparation for transport to what the divine voice termed the staging area for ascension. Not storage, not relocation to another temple. Ascension. A badly damaged text from the Temple of Nana at Ur written by someone identified only as Naram, keeper of the sacred vessels, describes remarkably similar experiences during the same general time frame. Naram's description of the presences that directed the removal is the most detailed account of direct divine encounter that survives from this period. He describes the entities as possessing physical forms. They were not invisible, not purely spiritual. They appeared human in basic structure, but the specifics diverge from human appearance in ways that Naram, a trained priest accustomed to symbolic language, is clearly struggling to render in literal terms. Their skin possessed a subtle luminescence, not glowing in the sense of a fire or a lamp, but catching and reflecting light in ways that normal skin does not, as if the surface absorbed and re-emitted rather than simply reflected, more pronounced in darkness than in torchlight. Their eyes reflected light in ways that reminded the priest of polished metal, and sometimes, Naram is careful here, noting his uncertainty, they appeared partially translucent, as if they occupied material reality as a choice rather than a necessity. These beings directed the removal of sacred objects with specific, consistent criteria. Precious metals were largely left. The astronomical calculation devices, the star maps inscribed on lapis lazuli, the tablets written in what Naram describes as the script of heaven, were packed with extraordinary care. The physical wealth of the temple was not taken. The knowledge and the tools that embodied it was. The high priestess Ninala of Lagash was not present for a divine departure. By the time she wrote her account, the gods had already gone from the great temples. What she documents instead is the experience of the aftermath, the silence. Her tablets are among the most emotionally direct documents in Mesopotamian literature. Ninala describes the failure of divination. The sacred lots began producing contradictory results. Where they had once provided clear guidance, they now gave random noise, as if the signal had gone out and only static remained. She describes the failure of dream incubation. Priests who slept in the sacred chambers expecting divine visions received instead only emptiness or disturbing images of abandoned landscapes, the persistent sensation of a room from which someone has recently departed, the feeling of an absence that should be a presence. Senior priests, who had regularly communicated with divine statues, came apart in various ways. Withdrawal, obsessive repetition of ritual, extended fasts. The hierarchy of trauma corresponded precisely to the hierarchy of connection. Those who had known the presence most directly suffered most acutely its absence. This is a recognizable psychological pattern, and its recognition across multiple independent accounts from multiple cities, each describing the same gradient of response, suggests that all of these witnesses were documenting the same actual event, not a change in belief, a change in reality. The gods had been there, and then they were not. Science is, at its core, the discipline of taking physical evidence seriously, and the physical evidence from the major Sumerian temple sites presents some extraordinarily difficult questions for conventional archaeological interpretation. Let us begin with the burn patterns at Nippur. Excavations, beginning in the 1950s at the Enlil Temple Complex, uncovered unusual scorch marks throughout the sacred precinct. These marks were identified early, studied carefully, and then, this is important, not fully explained. They do not fit any known pattern of ancient combustion. They do not correspond to fire damage from warfare, or accidental burning, or deliberate destruction. They appear in geometric configurations, precise geometric configurations, spiraling patterns that converge on central points, as if drawn by a compass, rather than produced by a natural fire. Channels burned into the limestone blocks in curves that maintain consistent widths and consistent depths across meter after meter of stone. Natural fires do not do this. Forensic analysis of the burn marks using modern spectroscopic techniques reveals temperatures that exceeded 2,000 degrees Celsius at the point of impact with the stone. 2,000 degrees Celsius. For context, a conventional Bronze Age furnace reached maximum temperatures of approximately 1,200 degrees Celsius, the extreme end of what ancient metallurgical technology could achieve under optimal conditions. Wood fires burn at temperatures between 600 and 900 degrees. Even a carefully controlled forge fire with forced air and specialized fuel could not approach 2,000 degrees. The stone at Nippur was subjected to an energy source that Bronze Age technology could not produce. And there is something else. The burn patterns contain no fuel residue, no combustion byproducts, no carbon deposits or ash traces that would indicate ordinary fire. Instead, spectrographic examination reveals trace elements of rare earth metals embedded within the fused stone matrix, elements that do not occur naturally in the geological environment of ancient Mesopotamia, elements that were, in the accepted historical narrative, completely unknown to Bronze Age cultures. They are in the stone, precisely at the focal points of the geometric burn patterns. Something deposited rare earth metals at 2,000 degrees Celsius in precise geometric spirals at a Bronze Age temple site. Conventional archaeology does not have an explanation for this. The vitrification evidence from the royal cemetery area at Ur is equally difficult to explain. Vitrification, the conversion of a material to a glass-like state through exposure to extreme heat, requires temperatures above the melting point of the material in question. For the sandstone and limestone common in Mesopotamian construction, vitrification requires approximately 1,400 to 1,600 degrees Celsius, sustained long enough to allow the material to flow and re-solidify. The vitrified sections at Ur appear in specific locations, discrete areas, patches of glass smooth surface surrounded by normal, unaffected stone. The boundaries between vitrified and unvitrified areas are sharp, not the gradual transition you would expect from a spreading fire, but the precise edge you would expect from a focused, controlled energy source with a defined boundary. The cuneiform tablets from Ur's archive identify the precise locations of these vitrified sections. They are the spots where, according to the textual record, divine beings manifested their presence during religious ceremonies. The physical and textual evidence agree, at the same locations, in the same sites, saying the same thing. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Babylon and Eridu have revealed something beneath the temple foundations that no published archaeological report has satisfactorily explained. Subsurface magnetic signatures that deviate significantly from normal geological patterns, not the random variations you find in any ancient construction site. These anomalies form regular geometric shapes. They maintain consistent intensity across varied terrain. At Eridu, the magnetometer readings reveal a network of linear anomalies, extending outward from the central temple complex in precisely straight lines for distances exceeding 2 kilometers. And they converge on specific points that correspond precisely to locations mentioned in cuneiform tablets as gathering places for divine beings. There is something under Eridu, a network of something, metallic, magnetic, engineered, whose geometry corresponds to the sacred geography described in ancient texts. The depth of these structures extends more than 100 meters below the surface. Modern tunneling technology could construct chambers at this depth. Ancient Mesopotamian engineering could not, and yet something is there, apparently constructed according to astronomical alignments mentioned in cuneiform astronomical texts. The metallurgical analysis tells perhaps the most immediately strange story. Bronze artifacts recovered from the Enlil temple at Nippur contain alloy compositions that include trace elements of platinum, iridium, and other rare metals. Platinum melts at 1,768 degrees Celsius, iridium at 2,446 degrees. Bronze Age smelting technology could achieve neither, and there is no evidence of Mesopotamian metallurgists working with these metals. The concentrations in the Nippur artifacts are too consistent across multiple objects to represent accidental contamination. The distribution pattern suggests deliberate incorporation. And then there is the golden ceremonial dagger. The blade maintains a consistent thickness of less than 0.1 millimeters along its entire length, a manufacturing tolerance that, when measured against known ancient working techniques, is simply impossible to achieve with hand tools. Modern precision machining achieves tolerances in the micrometer range, but requires CNC machinery and quality control processes developed over the past century. Reconstructed ancient techniques achieve tolerances in the range of several millimeters at best. The ancient dagger is precise to 1/10 of a millimeter. This is a physical object. It exists. It is in a collection. It can be examined, and it cannot be explained by conventional historical models of ancient technology. Perhaps the most unexpected physical evidence comes from chemical analysis of residues in ceremonial vessels. Samples from offering bowls at multiple sites contain organic molecules with complex molecular structures that suggest synthetic rather than natural origins. Polymer-like substances with properties similar to modern plastics, dating to periods thousands of years before such materials were supposedly developed, and from containers identified in the texts as holding divine food offerings. Residue samples contain proteins with amino acid sequences that do not match any known terrestrial organism. Every protein produced by life on Earth, every organism that has ever been catalogued by modern biology, produces proteins whose amino acid sequences fall within the known range of terrestrial biochemistry. The protein residues in the Sumerian ceremonial vessels do not share those signatures. The molecular configurations appear designed for specific nutritional or pharmacological purposes. The food that was offered to the Anunnaki was not food that grew on this earth. Make of that what you will, but make it carefully, because this is not speculation. This is chemistry. If what happened in Mesopotamia between 2400 and 2350 BC were a local event, the collapse of a regional religious tradition, the political disruption of a particular cultural sphere, we would expect the evidence to be contained. We would not expect to find the same evidence in Egypt. We would not expect to find it in the Indus Valley. We would not expect to find it in the archaeological record of cultures that had no meaningful contact with Mesopotamia, that spoke entirely different languages, that had developed their religious and artistic traditions in complete independence. And yet, the pyramid texts are among the oldest religious documents in human history, inscribed on the walls of the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, beginning around 2400 BC. They are written in a ritual language, so archaic that even contemporary Egyptian scribes found portions of the text difficult to interpret. The texts are concerned, at their core, with one thing: ascension, the journey of the deceased pharaoh from the earthly realm to the celestial realm. But embedded within the elaborate funerary liturgy are references that go beyond standard theology, references to the opening of the sky roads, to divine beings departing for the imperishable stars, to the systematic removal of sacred objects from major cult centers. The Egyptian temple archives of the late Old Kingdom document a crisis of religious authority that parallels the Mesopotamian accounts with remarkable specificity. The oracular systems that had provided divine communication for generations fell silent. Traditional ritual practices required fundamental modification. Senior priests developed new interpretive procedures to compensate for the absence of direct divine guidance. Egyptian texts from this period describe what they call the silence of the gods, not the temporary silences that religious tradition had always accommodated. A fundamental, permanent withdrawal of the communicative relationship between divine and human realms. The timing of these changes, occurring within decades of the Mesopotamian temple abandonments, in a civilization that maintained cultural contact with Mesopotamia but had developed its own entirely independent religious tradition, is not easily dismissed as coincidence. The Indus Valley civilization presents an even more striking case. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the great urban centers of the Indus Valley, cities of astonishing planning and sophistication, were not destroyed. They were not conquered. They were not gradually depopulated as climate change made them unviable. They were abandoned, suddenly, with a completeness and a speed that archaeologists who have studied the site find difficult to account for through any conventional mechanism. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a structure of unmistakable religious significance, shows evidence of formal closure rather than gradual abandonment. The drainage systems were systematically sealed. The purification protocols appear to have been followed for a final time, and then concluded with deliberate closure procedures. At Kalibangan, another major Indus Valley site, the fire altars were systematically dismantled, and the sacred fires extinguished according to specific protocols. The evidence of careful, intentional closure at these fire altars parallels the evidence from Mesopotamian sites with a specificity that is difficult to attribute to cultural diffusion alone. The civilizations of the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia had trade contacts, but the detailed protocols for closing sacred sites, the sequence of procedures, the care taken with specific categories of ritual objects, are too similar, too specific, to represent the transmission of a general cultural idea. Somebody trained both sets of priests, or gave both sets of priests the same instructions. In the mythological traditions of cultures that had no known contact with Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, the story appears again. The Norse concept of Ragnarok describes a final departure of divine beings from active involvement in earthly affairs. The Aesir do not simply die. They withdraw from the world that they have inhabited and shaped. The Mesoamerican traditions preserve accounts of feathered serpent deities, Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec tradition, Kukulkan in the Mayan, who ascended to celestial realms with explicit promises to return. The promise of return was taken seriously enough that the arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the early 16th century was initially interpreted by some Mesoamerican leaders as the prophesied return. Hindu scriptures describe the withdrawal of divine avatars at the end of cosmic cycles. The Kali Yuga, the current age in Hindu cosmological reckoning, is explicitly characterized as the age of divine absence. Native American traditions across multiple culture groups contain detailed accounts of star beings who came from the sky, lived among humans, taught knowledge, and then returned to their celestial homes. The accounts specify sky vehicles. They specify the transmission of specific kinds of knowledge: astronomical, agricultural, medical, architectural. They specify the promise of eventual return. None of these cultures were in contact with each other during the period when these traditions presumably formed. They are independent witnesses, separated by thousands of miles, describing the same event. The atmospheric evidence may be the most objective data point in this entire investigation. Ice cores, columns of ancient ice extracted from Greenland and Antarctic glaciers, preserve a chemical record of Earth's atmosphere, extending back hundreds of thousands of years. The chemistry of precipitation, of airborne particles, of cosmic ray interactions with atmospheric gases, is locked into the ice as it accumulates year by year, preserving a global record that no human civilization has the capacity to falsify. Analysis of ice core samples from the late 3rd millennium BC shows anomalous atmospheric signatures, elevated concentrations of metallic particles whose specific elements, isotopic ratios, and distribution patterns do not correspond to known volcanic activity or meteorite impact events. The chemical signatures match materials found in soil samples from Mesopotamian temple sites. The atmosphere over the entire planet, during the window corresponding to the divine departure, contained elevated concentrations of materials that appear to have originated at or near the Mesopotamian temple complexes. Something happened at those sites that was large enough to send material into the global atmosphere, something whose chemical signature has been preserved for 4,500 years in the ice of Greenland and Antarctica. The physical event at the heart of the divine departure was real, it was global in its effects, and it left a record in the ice that does not care what anyone chooses to believe about its cause. Consider for a moment what it means for an entire civilization to lose its operating system, not its government, not its economy, not its military capacity, its fundamental framework for understanding reality, the cosmological architecture within which every decision, every institution, every social relationship had been organized for over 1,000 years. The Sumerian theocratic system was not simply a government with religious elements. It was a total organizational principle. The gods owned the land. The gods made the laws. The gods determined the fates. Human institutions were extensions of divine authority. Human rulers derived legitimacy from divine appointment. Human law was divine commandment. And then, the gods left. Within decades, a breathtaking speed, by the standards of institutional change, the entire theocratic system collapsed. What replaced it bears almost no resemblance to what preceded it. The administrative tablets from major Mesopotamian cities document the transformation with meticulous precision. The Temple of Nana at Ur had previously administered nearly 40% of total agricultural output in the surrounding region. Within a single administrative year following the divine departure, these holdings were transferred to secular authorities. Property was no longer the gods' property administered by human agents. It was simply property owned and controlled by human institutions. The Code of Ur-Nammu, traditionally dated to around 2100 BC, but representing the codification of practices that emerged immediately after the divine departure, is remarkable precisely for what it does not contain. It does not derive its authority from divine revelation. The law is not presented as the word of the gods. It is presented as the considered judgment of human administrators working to maintain social order. Human law, not divine law. A document that would have been conceptually incoherent to the generation that preceded it. The shift required a fundamental reconceptualization of political legitimacy. Legitimacy through military prowess, through administrative competence, through popular support, through codified law applied consistently to all members of society. These ideas, which seem natural to us now, because they have organized human political life for so long, were radical innovations in the wake of divine departure. They were solutions to a problem that no one had anticipated, developed by human beings who found themselves suddenly responsible for functions that had previously been divine prerogatives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its earliest versions, composed in the centuries immediately following the divine departure, is a different text than the later polished versions, known from the great library of Ashurbanipal. It is angrier, more raw, more directly engaged with the question that the entire civilization was grappling with. What does a human being do when the gods are gone? Gilgamesh loses his companion Enkidu to death and responds with a frenzy of grief that the text makes no attempt to soften or rationalize. He could not save Enkidu. The divine connections that might have intervened were unavailable. The protection that divine favor had formerly provided was withdrawn. His quest for immortality, his desperate journey to the edges of the known world in search of the plant that reverses death, is not a mythological allegory. It is the direct expression of a civilization's experience of abandonment. We were supposed to be protected. We were supposed to have guidance. We were supposed to have access to something that transcended the limitations of mortal flesh. And it left. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed. The text does not give him consolation. He looks at the walls of his city, great walls, walls that will endure for centuries, and takes from them what meaning he can. Human achievement, permanent enough perhaps, lasting enough. It is not what he wanted, but it is what there is now. The massive ziggurats constructed during the Akkadian and later Babylonian periods are usually understood as expressions of royal power and religious devotion. They were those things, but they were also something else, something that the textual evidence from the period of their construction makes explicit. They were attempts to close the distance. The gods had gone up. The astronomical diaries, the priestly accounts, the mythological texts, all agreed on the direction of departure. Upward, celestial. The divine beings had ascended to the Pleiades, to the celestial assembly, to the heaven road. If the gods were above, then reaching them required height, human height, physical height, a mountain, if you were lucky enough to have a mountain, a constructed mountain, if you were building a civilization in the flat alluvial plain between two rivers. The ziggurat at Ur-Nammu, the ziggurat at Babylon, that eventually gave rise to the biblical Tower of Babel tradition. The great, staged towers of multiple Mesopotamian cities. These were not architecture for human use. The upper levels were not places where people worshipped. They were carefully oriented according to astronomical calculations designed to maximize their visibility and accessibility to beings traveling along the heaven road. The texts say this explicitly, not metaphorically. The ziggurats were built to be seen from above and to provide access points for divine beings who might choose to return. They were, in the most literal possible sense, an invitation. And in every tradition, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Mesoamerican, Norse, Hindu, the departure is described as temporary, not a permanent abandonment, not a final severing, a withdrawal. The Mesopotamian texts describe divine beings departing with explicit assurances. The period of direct involvement was concluding. Humanity would continue its development under its own direction, guided by the written records and the architectural legacy and the knowledge systems that had been deliberately transmitted before the departure. And at a specified time, a time tied to astronomical cycles that the departing entities understood far better than the humans they were leaving. The conditions that had made direct involvement appropriate would recur. They would return. The countdown tablet found at U7847, the calendar that ends with the heaven road opens, was not only a record of departure. The astronomical framework it documents is a cycle. The celestial configurations that marked the moment of leaving can be calculated forward as well as backward. Modern astronomical software can run those calculations. Among the silver tablets found in the sealed chamber beneath the altar at Nippur, inscribed in a form of cuneiform predating standard Akkadian script by several centuries, there is a section that deals not with the procedures of leaving, but with the conditions of return. The text is fragmentary. Several lines are missing. The reconstruction is uncertain in places, but what survives is specific. The return, according to the tablets, would be preceded by signs, astronomical signs, configurations calculable to any civilization sophisticated enough to track celestial mechanics with precision. Terrestrial signs, technological achievements that the departing entities apparently expected humanity to accomplish within a defined period, and what the text calls signs of readiness, evidence that the species being left behind had developed sufficient understanding of its own nature and sufficient ethical maturity to resume direct contact without catastrophic consequences. The astronomical signs, we can calculate those, the celestial configurations that the tablets associate with the conditions for return, occur within cycles that modern astronomical models can precisely track. The technological achievements, space travel, genetic engineering, global communication, the capacity to detect incoming objects from space, we have those. The signs of readiness, those are harder to assess. The tablets do not define them precisely, but the implication is clear. Readiness is a question that applies to us, not to the entities who departed, to humanity. Are we ready? 4,500 years ago, in temples that are now rubble beneath the sand of southern Iraq, beings whose nature we do not fully understand packed their instruments and their records and their unknown food into containers designed for a long journey, gave instructions to frightened priests, and ascended through a gate in the sky. They left behind their architecture, their knowledge systems, their genetic contributions to the priestly lineages that maintained what they left. And they left behind the promise, recorded on clay tablets that have survived 4,000 years of burial, in texts that serious scholars can read and translate today, that what was concluded was not ended. The heaven road, wherever it leads, runs in both directions, and somewhere in the mathematics of the ancient sky, if you know what to look for, there is a date. The watchers no longer see, but the sky is still there, and we have learned, again, to watch it. Let that thought carry you into sleep tonight, into the deep past, and possibly the approaching future, into the long span of something that may not have concluded, only paused. Close your eyes. The night is quiet, and the stars are walking.